Discourse at Jesuit universities often seems to assume that there is a Jesuit ethics. But the question is whether there can be a distinctively Jesuit ethics. If so, what is Jesuit ethics? If there is not a Jesuit ethics, is there a uniquely Jesuit approach to ethics? Such a question can be divided into many relevant areas. What is the relationship between ethics and Jesuit spirituality? What is the Jesuit understanding of justice, and how is it unique? What is the relationship between Jesuit education and ethics? What is the relationship between ethics and the history of Jesuit involvement in politics? What is the relationship between the Jesuit order and the history of ecclesial moral teaching? Is there a uniquely Jesuit content to men and women for others? There will be 12 lectures throughout the year exploring these questions. All of the lectures will be here in the Connaughton boardroom, and all of them, with the exception of the next one, will be at 7 p.m. The next lecture on September 23rd by Professor Lisa Fulham from the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, that one lecture will be at 4 p.m. Professor Kathleen Smythe from Xavier University will speak on October 1st. Reverend Jim Keenan from Boston College on October 16th. Reverend Kevin Burke from the Jesuit School of Theology on October 22nd. And Reverend David McConey from St. Louis University on November 12th. Next semester, Reverend Stefano Battassi will speak on February 5th. He's from the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Jerusalem. Reverend David Hollenbach from Boston College on February 12th. Reverend Christopher Collins from St. Louis University on March 11th. Reverend John Paris from Boston College on March 16th. Reverend Drew Christensen from Georgetown on March 27th. And Professor Eleanor Stump from St. Louis University on April 9th. Our speaker this evening, Father Joseph Kotersk, received an HAB from Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. So we are welcoming back this evening one of our own. His STL is from the Weston School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and his doctorate in philosophy is from St. Louis University. He is an associate professor of philosophy at Fordham University, and he's the editor-in-chief of the International Philosophical Quarterly. He is the author of more than 90 articles and an Introduction to Medieval Philosophy Basic Concepts. He is the co-editor of many works, including Medieval Education, Culture and Creed, The Two Wings of Catholic Thought, Essays on Fides et Ratio, Karl Jaspers on the Philosophy of History and the History of Philosophy, and Prophecy and Diplomacy, the Moral Teaching of John Paul II. So please please join me in welcoming back this evening our alumnus, Father Joseph Kotersk.
Dr. Sweeney, thank you very much. Can you hear okay in the back? Is this working? Good. All right. Thank you so much for this opportunity to come and be the inaugural speaker. I very much agree with the set of questions that you posed. I think you will probably, in the course of this year, hear a number of very different positions, different answers to some of those questions, and I think that all of them are really quite relevant to that idea. What I'd like to do tonight is perhaps to set the stage and to start the debate, start the dialogue on that. I'll start by mentioning three things I'm not going to do, but that I think ought to be done by somebody in the course of the year, and then with the due diligence and as quickly as I can, get to what I would like to focus on. And there, as you can see from the handout that you've given you, What I'm going to be suggesting is that the answer to the question about is there a Jesuit ethics has to be taken in terms of Jesuit spirituality. So you see on that handout 2 of the exercises from within Ignatius's book, the spiritual exercises. I'll get to that. You'll also find on the handout on the other side some comparisons between various kinds of normative theories of ethics. And so I want to weigh in a little bit on the question that was posed about whether Jesuit ethics constitutes another contender in that field. I think that it does not, but rather I will attempt to suggest that there's something about the educational philosophy in any Jesuit school that will mean a real embrace of the study of competing normative theories, but that we can make a certain contribution to by trying to integrate our picture of the human person and our picture of metaphysics with some of those normative theories. Some are compatible, some are not. So that's what I'm aiming to talk about tonight. So first, the 3 things that I don't want to talk about, tonight at least, although I hope that you will. I think the question about whether there's a Jesuit ethics could be about whether there is some special understanding of how to approach ethical questions by Jesuits or those in Jesuit schools that somehow is governed by the documents in the Society of Jesus. There are any number of statements about ethical topics, especially in some of our recent congregations. Some of the questions about justice, for instance, are handled in those documents. Some of those considerations of the need to have faith serving people and that there be an integration of faith and justice. I think those are important questions. If I were handling that, which I'm not, I would probably have to be critical of the way in which it's usually done. And my criticism, though I'm not going to attempt to focus on that too much tonight, is largely that justice is sometimes a code word for a certain political program. And I think that it is often muddied, the stances there, by taking a certain particular stance in politics and acting as though that is justice in a general manner, and I don't think that it is. Likewise, I think there has to be a very strong sense of what faith means in that phrase, and I find that sometimes that gets muddied. So I'm giving you my position. I really do think that in conversations like this that we're having tonight, and in the conversations you'll have all year, one ought to lay one's cards on the table. And so I'll put my card on that table. Maybe we'll get into it in the conversation section. Secondly, I think that there can be a question about whether there is a common stance the Jesuits actually do take with regard to Jesuit ethics. That, I think, is an interesting question in the sociology of knowledge, and as one of my favorite sayings from Polish culture likes to say, too windy for my feathers. That is, I think that there are some interesting questions there about what Jesuits actually do. I'm not going to attempt to do a sociology of knowledge. Thirdly, I think that there's a possibility about the longitudinal studies that Dr. Sweeney also mentioned, namely the history of thought and the history of Jesuit schools. Being a history that is about 450 years long with respect to the conduct of schools, there certainly are some interesting trends that can be discerned. One thinks, for instance, of the way in which Jesuit officials weighed in on some of the questions after the discovery and the colonization of the New World and the need to defend the personhood of the Native Americans, native populations that were here. There were both Jesuit and important Dominican contributions. That kind of thing, I think, is an important question, although beyond my pale tonight. It's one of those questions on which you will find a lot of interesting research projects. That is, as people of the Jesuit and Dominican orders particularly were thinking about those questions, some things they could see so clearly. You know, for instance, the story of the Jesuit reductions. Have many of you seen the movie The Mission? You know, you've seen that, you've heard the music, and there's an enormously important contribution that's made there. On the other hand, there are blind spots there too, and it's very interesting. I was just reading a little bit of the Dominicans and de las Casas, who's one of the great theorists about that. And yet, even in a figure like Des Casas, who had such an enormous contribution to the recognition of the personhood of the Indian populations, the American native populations here, curiously, he still seems to have tolerated slavery. That is, how we need to really protect and preserve these native populations here, but there also is need for the importation of lots of workers, and he doesn't seem to have made any critical remarks about slavery or those coming from Africa. It's a really curious blind spot, and for us, it's hard to understand that. So I think that there could be legitimate longitudinal studies, whether on that or on other issues. When I was trying to do the research to put this paper together, I consulted some of the great books that are available on Jesuit bibliographies. I don't know whether you have them here in the Xavier Library, but there, for instance, is a 6-volume set edited by a man named Polgar, which gives you the bibliography up through the year 1970 on many topics. It has very little on Jesuit ethics or Jesuit approaches to philosophy. Likewise, there's a Diccionario Histórico de la Compañía de Jesús of enormous proportion, fascinating book, and you can do some of these interesting studies. Very little on Jesuit philosophy, a lot on moral theology. And then, interestingly, they trace some of the things that ought to be discussed of a longitudinal sort. For instance, the development of casuistry, that is, working on an approach to ethics that makes use of cases like a law school would, or probabilism and probabiliorism, and that too was an interesting Jesuit contribution to that. My only focus tonight, however, will be on a different question than those, but I want to recommend those to your consideration for answering this question. Rather than do a sociological or a longitudinal study or a documentary study, what I'd like to offer you is what I think a Jesuit program in ethics ought to be, based especially on our Jesuit spirituality and on the approach that we take with respect to what the human person is and what the vision of the world and the whole universe is. I think that it has certain implications for what a Jesuit ethics is, and so I'd like to present that to you here. And if there had to be a title, a subtitle perhaps, I guess it would be the need for an integrative approach, that is, needing to integrate things. And I've attempted to do it with the title that I proposed, namely the antinomies that are involved in a Jesuit ethics. I'm going to list 6 of them, and I'll discuss some of them at greater length, but perhaps here for just a minute while we're getting started, let me just go through each of the 6. You can perhaps take them down in your notes if you wish. First, I think that there is a consideration about ethics as an academic discipline and ethics as a way of life. Presumably, in your own experience of growing up, in your families, in your parishes, in your communities with the media of a given culture like our own, one thinks about the way of life, right? Your parents, your friends, your teachers, your clergy have tried to show a way of living ethically and in the practical order thinking about things. On the other hand, when one comes to college, one tends to get discipline-based approaches that are perhaps a little abstract. Good that they are. My point in mentioning it here is that I think much of modern education, high school, even more so at the university, I think much of modern education has made a fundamental, very grave mistake. And the mistake that I think they've made, and I want to say Jesuit ethics in terms of what it ought to be correcting that. The mistake I think they make is this, that in our own human growth as human beings, we need both the educables and the learnables. That is, the learnables are all the things we learn in school. And you have, as I have, from the time when we started school, been given various learnables, whether it was learning the mathematics table or eventually getting trigonometry or perhaps negotiating the deep waters of calculus, learning lots of things. Likewise, in chemistry classes, in literature classes, in history classes, in philosophy classes, in theology classes, it's easy to treat those things as the learnables, the abstract things that need to be learned in a school setting and tested for. But there is a need to connect that with the other ways in which we need to be educated. We need to be formed morally. We need to be formed in terms of a life of prayer. We need to be formed in terms of a life of learning the day-to-day respect for one another in families and dormitories, in corporations, in communities. And the ways in which those educables need to take place have, in my judgment, been curiously separated in most institutions of higher learning and in many institutions of secondary learning. And hence, it seems to me that they do a great service, because it's not as easy for everybody to get those things connected. It seems to me that they need to be connected. It would be a shame if they don't get connected, and that in Jesuit ethics, I think that would be just a great shame if they were not. What does this look like in practice? Difficult to say, but it's a matter of not only learning positions, learning how to argue for positions, learning to bring up the plausible objections to positions, learning how to answer those plausible objections, the things that one would do, let's say, in a good philosophy or a good theology class, but it's also feeling the great incentive to living the virtues, living in accord with the law, the natural law, and with the divine law, living in accord with the various proper and legitimate forms of authority. And that putting those together, I think, sometimes does not happen. One finds in the classroom a great concern for the learnables, but sometimes the educables are not treated in the same breath or by the same people or with those connections being made, whereas it can be done. Interestingly, in the history of Jesuit education, one of the subjects I'm not going to try to treat at any detail tonight, our form of education in those 450 years emerged out of the Renaissance. It emerged out of Renaissance humanism. And in Renaissance humanism, by way of a certain very conscious antagonism toward the scholastic learning that was typical of the Middle Ages, the humanist scholars and those universities, insofar as they adopted the humanist program, understood the humanist concern not just for logic, but the humanist concern for grammar and for rhetoric, not to be narrow discipline studies, but broad, intricative kind of studies. That is, when you hear about the liberal arts and about grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the philosophers love the logic. We do love to chop the logic. But on the other hand, what it meant for the Renaissance humanists and the Jesuit program of education, as it began and as it was continued, was taking grammar not just as the rules for writing and speaking Latin well, and taking rhetoric not just as the rules for how to speak persuasively and win arguments, but the study of biography, history, literature, philosophy, law, and theology, and to do it in a way that was not only focused on the learnables in the actual disciplines, but with the developmentals, that is, learning to cultivate the reading of biography and the learning of history for the sake of actually doing and living ethically as the result of it. Good government, good community. Very short interruption here. At Fordham, one of my tasks is being the secretary for the Phi Beta Kappa Association. And so last year or 2 years ago, we put on a session for the whole New York area. And what we were focusing on was a truly wonderful book by an historian from Yale, Tim Snyder, whose book is called Bloodlands. It's about the collaboration between Hitler and Stalin even before the war, and the way in which they so pragmatically used one another, using opposition as well as using friendliness, for the enormous bloodbath that took place in Central Europe. So we had him come, and the topic he was supposed to address was, does history matter? He could not, unfortunately, bring himself to answer that question yes, even though he wrote the book, which in my judgment is probably the best book in the last 10 years for demonstrating that thesis. But no matter how hard we pressed him in the conversation period, he couldn't say that learning history has the effect that I would hope that it would have as part of this humanist integrative vision. My point is not to criticize Tim Snyder, he's a friend, but my point is to suggest the importance of having the connection between the academic discipline and the actual art of living. Second point, I think that there is a question about integrating philosophy and theology. These are normally the disciplines in a university, especially at the level of the learnables, that is, where we're involved in the classroom and are considering the academic study of these things. It is a matter of integrating philosophy and theology. Admittedly, they are different in method, They are different in method in that philosophy insists that what we have are clear terms, true propositions, valid reasoning for the sake of a sound argument, and that when we're examining the evidence patterns and trying to give a good clear sense of what counts and what doesn't count, we can't directly in philosophy by philosophical method privilege revelation. Whereas in a theology department, there should be, in my judgment, the privileging of revelation. That is, we should be doing Catholic theology in a Catholic university, just as I think they ought to be doing Protestant theology in a Protestant university. That is, they ought to be taking revelation. Admittedly, they will take it with a Protestant perspective on some crucial issues. Instead, I don't even know what's the case here at Xavier. I meant to look this up before I came. I think it's unfortunate when theology departments have become religious studies departments or departments in comparative religion. Not unfortunate for the sake of the learnables, where I think that is really quite interesting, but on the other hand, for the sake of the developmentals, it doesn't allow what I think needs to be allowed, the notion that the things presented in a theology course, not just theological ethics, but in the other parts of a theology course or a theology curriculum, do take the stand of the privileged character of revelation, that it is a higher source than any form of human reasoning could possibly be in this matter and needs to be respected. Granted, that will have further implications down the line. My point, as we'll see when I get just a little bit further, is to suggest that the integration of philosophy and theology is one of those antinomies, the both and. Even that word antinomy, this may be expanding your vocabulary a little bit, I don't know. It expanded my vocabulary when I was here. Some of you may remember Father Bill King. Father Keneally remembers Father Bill King. Some of the rest of you do. He served as the chaplain where I stayed. I lived over in Marion Hall as part of the HAB program here, and we had that. And he served there as our chaplain for most of the years that I was there. But I remember talking with him one time and asking him what his dissertation was about. And he was telling us it was about the antinomies in the thought of Cardinal Newman. I had to go and do some dictionary work at the end of that conversation. But it was good dictionary work, thinking about the way in which antinomies work. That is, things that are sometimes thought to be simply opposed because they're different can in fact have a complementary difference. And so I offer that word antinomies here to suggest the complementary difference that I'm envisioning in these 6 pairs that I have. So the second one, the antinomy of philosophy and theology. I don't know that they will necessarily reach different conclusions. In fact, I would hope that those clear terms and true propositions and valid forms of reasoning means that we will often, but not always, manage to achieve the same conclusion that might come from revelation. I think that there's some areas where we would only know the answer through revelation, just as I think that there's some areas where revelation doesn't make a contribution. It doesn't tell us anything that I have yet been able to discover, but that there's an enormous area of overlap and that they deserve, especially as part of a Jesuit ethics, to be handled together, but nonetheless handled according to their methodological difference. A third area, and related to the second one, is the area of sacraments and Scripture. What I mean by relating this point about sacraments and Scripture here is that I don't think it should be just the learnables, but should also be the developmentals. And the developmentals include a religious life. As I'll try to show when I get to the portion of the handout that deals with some of those spiritual exercises, I think that it is vital for people who are receiving a Jesuit education and people who are giving one to make the spiritual exercises or to have something comparable and to have a religious, sacramental, and scriptural life. That is, there is something that one will only get when one's eyes have been opened to some of these truths, and there's some things that will only be able to be seen when one has received a certain kind of clarity and even purification. I'll come back to that one, so I'm going to get to the sacramental part and this clarification when I turn to the first of the points on the handout. But right now let me also talk about the Scriptures, and I envision sacrament and Scripture as going together in a kind of antinomy. The Scriptures, of course, are vital for the sake of theology as having a basis in revelation. That is, it's not just religious studies, It's not just comparative religion. It's not just that tradition, interesting but nonetheless different, of treatment of matters of religion as one of the learnables. It's also a matter of a developmental. That is, it's a matter of coming to learn to read the Scriptures and to read it right. Let me again do a short parenthesis before I get back to the main thrust of this. Could you either put on your notes or perhaps remember the numbers 100 to 130? Those are paragraph numbers in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And when you have a chance, I would highly recommend a read or reread of those paragraphs. It's not long. What you'll find there is this. The Church, Catholic Church, insists that there are 4 levels for senses of Scripture. And the 4 levels, very brief summary, this is a much more elaborate topic. The 4 levels are the literal level and the 3 spiritual levels. The literal level is probably the one that's most misunderstood, because most people think the literal level means, oh, those fundamentalists, they read everything literally. Wrong. What the literal sense of the Scriptures means is what the human author, under divine inspiration, intended. See the difference? The literal level, therefore, can include history, but the literal level can also include metaphor or any other human figure of speech. It can have tales of various sorts and stories that are intended as fictional. They're not historical. And yet it's the literal level, because what the literal level means is what the human author, under divine inspiration, intends. Just a quick example. When the Psalms say, "My God is a rock," the literal level doesn't mean that they thought he was a piece of granite. Right? The literal level is a metaphor. And it's a literal simply because it's what the human author intended. The spiritual senses are 3. They're called the spiritual senses because they are what the Holy Spirit intended, whether the human author knew it or not. They're a little more complex. Let me do the simple version for the sake of staying on track. The 2, 3, and 4, that is, these 3 spiritual senses, are the typological, the moral, and the anagogical. Here's the typological in a nutshell. Think of the life of Christ as the dominant and controlling hermeneutic, the dominant and controlling part of the Scriptures. The typological level means that the life of Christ, from the time when he is incarnate all the way through his death and resurrection, is somehow in parallel with the life of Israel over many generations, but as if it were one lifetime. And so what this typological level means is that Christ is the new Adam, Christ is the new Isaac, Christ is the new Moses, Christ is the new David, Christ is the new, etc. But that at every stage, he is correcting what is wrong, he is perfecting what is imperfect, he is sanctifying what is sinful. Likewise, there's actually a third one, and the third part of it is that we must learn to grow according to his pattern. I think that insight alone ought to be the basis of virtually every course in Catholic theology. Unfortunately, in my judgment, that has often gotten lost and disconnected, and many a theology course gets treated purely as a set of learnables about a certain person's position or viewpoint, but disconnected from the very heart of revelation. The next part of the 3 spiritual senses is the moral level, and it's not only the commandments of the Old Testament and commandments of the New, but it's also the stories about virtues and vice, some of the moral tales, where God is presenting his perspective, his normative perspective on what morality ought to be. The last one, the anagogical, you could translate that sacramental. That is, it's how we get back to heaven. And so there's a deep connection between the anagogical sense of the Scriptures and almost all of the theology of the sacraments. What I mean to suggest by all that information, I'm acting as though this were about the learnables, giving you too much information, but what I'm intending to suggest in terms of my thesis is, if one is to integrate, and I think it must be integrated within a Jesuit ethics, philosophy and theology, one must also integrate both the sacraments as having a real causality. Baptism isn't just a nice ceremony for being welcomed. Communion isn't just a nice ceremony in which we all happen to go up and do the same act, but rather that there's a causality. That is, baptism really does begin our regeneration. And it begins that regeneration by putting the life of God within us, forgiving any sin up until that point, and begins to make, by the friendship with Jesus now within us, begins to make us different. It has a causal efficacy. Likewise with Holy Communion, what we're focusing on is the deep efficacy of having Christ within us in Holy Communion. And that one only gets the fullness of that, I think, by understanding the complete nature of the Scriptures and the way in which they're to be read and the way in which they're to be cultivated as prayer. Let me move on to the fourth one of my set of 6. The fourth one is the topic of nature and grace. This next numbers 4, 5, and 6 in a way will be a little more specifically focused on ethics, where numbers 1, 2, and 3, that is the focus in particular on the academic discipline and the way of life, number 1. Number 2, the focus on integrating philosophy and theology. Number 3, the focus on sacraments and Scripture. In a way, those are sort of meta-ethical topics because they talk about the way in which we need to approach any teaching or any problem-solving in ethics. But numbers 4, 5, and 6, I think, are more content-focused. So number 4 is nature and grace. Grace, of course, must, I think, be understood in a strong and Catholic way for this to be a good and valid form of Jesuit ethics. Grace has been understood in many different ways in the course of the history of thought. Sometimes, as in the Pelagian period that's been picked up in subsequent periods of history, grace has tended to mean moral example. We point out respectable, highly praiseworthy examples, and we say, it's a grace to know that. Or grace can be taken as very extrinsic. In a way, the Lutheran approach to grace has that extrinsicism to it. We will never really be healed from within, but perhaps we'll be saved from without. Luther actually had some fairly choice images for describing that. The Jesuit approach, which emerges, of course, in the period directly after Luther, goes back, I think, to a much more integrated vision of nature and grace, namely the way in which God has made all of our natures, that is, the natures of all the things in the universe, and has put a direction, put a certain end-directedness there, and has made them good, but that after the fall, a fall that affected all of creation, such that all of creation groans, nature needs to be repaired and restored. And so the traditional Jesuit teaching on the topic of grace was always one in which grace does come from God as his gift, but it comes within in order to heal and repair and restore. I think that there is room and place for the integration of nature and grace in a Jesuit ethics. It's why on the second part of the second side, as soon as I get there, what you will find is a reference to some bibliographical items about natural law. Natural law, I think, ought to be at the cornerstone of a Jesuit approach to ethics in philosophy and theology. It has been on hard times for some decades now. In particular, I think the event that precipitated the hard times for natural law thinking was the way in which Paul VI used it in Humanae Vitae, an extremely prophetic encyclical, the one having to do with contraception and the Church's reasons for opposing contraception. But he gave there not only a strong natural law argument, but that he also provided in certain ways a prophetic anticipation of what has actually taken place. When one becomes forgetful of nature, when one starts having the idea of nature that was too prominent, in my judgment, in modern philosophy, one in which there is a real sort of split between what we find in nature and anything we find in ethics, there comes to be some very dire cultural consequences. It seems to me then that on the question of nature and grace, much room for scholarly discussion, and it's been a great source of scholarly discussion, but I think much room for making it a part of Jesuit ethics in philosophy and in theology. It comes into philosophy, I think, especially because we are able to know various things about our natures. If I were to summarize just the very first book that appears in the bibliographical section of your handout, the one by Russ Hittinger, if it's not the first, it's somewhere down the page there, The First Grace, his thesis is that any sound theory of natural law will have to have three important areas of focus: God, our nature, and our knowing. Namely, unless there is a God who actually designed the nature and gave it a certain end-directedness, we won't have a natural law theory. Secondly, there has to be a human nature that is still intact, enough for us to see the directions that God has given, the commands that he has written, the other inclinations to virtue that he has already inscribed. We need a nature to look at. And third, reason, the epistemological section. That is, we have got to have sufficiently strong and powerful minds such that we can read those directions within our nature as what God has designed. We shouldn't, on the other hand, make the mistake that a pure nature is alone enough to give us what we need in ethics. The reason, of course, is that we believe in not only a creation with that end-directedness, but we also still seriously hold to the doctrine of the fall and to subsequent sin, and hence there is need for real repair, there's need for real inner transformation, and that's what grace does. In my ideal world of what a Jesuit education should look like, the role that Jesuit ethics would play in this is that there would be a stereophonic philosophical and theological approach in the same semester, so that they could feed off one another, so that one could try to understand how much we can get on our own and how much we need revelation for the knowledge and grace for the healing of precisely some of those wounds that still so seriously afflict us. The next one has to do with law and virtue. There are some versions of ethics, I'll get around to that diagram in just a second, there are some versions of ethics that are primarily law ethics, whether they be fundamentalist theories of revelation, holding that only the revelation of the divine law in the Decalogue or Christ's law in the New Testament, that only those are the real proper and obligatory nature part of ethics. On the other hand, there are increasingly philosophical deontological theories from Kant on. I think we see a very strong tradition there. And yet, with Kant, the nature part of it disappears. For Kant, perhaps you've had a chance to read him in your philosophical ethics, something very brilliant. A format that John Paul II, for instance, has taken up in his own writings in what he calls the personalist principle that occurs in his fascinating book, The Acting Person. But that there is an effort, if you take a more strictly Kantian approach, there is something that restricts the generation of those laws to human reasoning of itself, namely the famous categorical imperative that is offered in support of the service of autonomy and the service of freedom that Kant so privileges. And that what Kant does is to say, whatever maxim of a moral nature you're tempted and attracted to, you may do so, and you yourself may impose it on yourself so long as it can be universalized. That is, no exceptions for you. Insofar as you make it a decree for everyone else, you must also abide by it. If it's a permission you want to take, everyone else must have the same permission. While there's something admirable about the format principle there, the universalizability, there's something seriously deficient by not having a sense of nature, nor the permission to consult revelation. For Kant, both of those would be heteronymous. It seems to me that we would profit and prosper in Jesuit ethics by integrating them, perhaps along the style that John Paul II did in such an interesting way. But likewise, in considering that question, there's also the virtue questions. Perhaps here, I don't know your departments well enough, perhaps some have focused your ethics courses or their own writing on virtue ethics, and I think that highly admirable. But on the other hand, it's not enough by itself, especially by virtue of the fact that virtue is usually taken to be the perfection of our nature, the perfection of our way of living in community, And it doesn't adequately, it seems to me, deal with those who are recalcitrant, those who also must be dealt with in a community, whether ourselves when tempted or when dealing with whole elements of the population that are not raised in virtue. There's a way in which law can play that role. Let me do just a third short interruption with a personal story. When we were Jesuit novices, one of the things they almost invariably have a Jesuit novice do, I'll ask Father Keneally later, did he had to do it, but we have to work in prisons for a while. I was at a prison in Berks County, where our novitiate was, and when we got to the prison, the first thing the warden said to us was, "I want to talk to you guys. Don't give them any cigarettes." Why would we give them cigarettes? Because they'll ask for cigarettes. Now they probably ask for more things. It's part of the economy of a prison, how they sell things to one another, who's in charge. He says, you'll upset the economy. What I'm trying to do is to give the people in Berks County Prison their first taste in all their life, for some of them, of a system of law that is both firm and fair. They're used to lots of firmness to the point of violence, but there was no fairness to it. They are not really believing that anything is fair. They tend to live, he didn't say, I put in his words, in a Hobbesian universe of power. And what they have to learn is the possibility of being firm but also fair. In a way, this is the role that law plays. So I would like to say that I think a Jesuit ethics needs necessarily to have a programmatic place within the learnables for the integration of law and virtue, and that in the developmental side, it's why there needs to be a correlation of that in the res life. There needs to be a correlation of that in campus politics. There needs to be great discussion and debate. One of the things that I would love to see more on my campus than there is, I presume I'd probably like to see more of it here on the Xavier campus that there is real debate. And the opportunity really to do in a civilized manner the expressions of disagreement with reasons, with objections, with responses and interchange. At the dormitory where I reside, there at Fordham, I live as the housemaster in a freshman dormitory called Queen's Court, beautiful building in a U-shape, statue of Blessed Mother in the center, hence called Queen's Court. We do some very formal debates. The students there pick the topics. The one they picked for the first one this semester is whether athletes should be paid, student athletes in colleges, great topic. Really has two sides to it. But then we flip a coin for who's on what side. Because you have to learn how to debate it from the other point of view. I myself think that there is no area that ought to be off limits with regard to the debates, but that there does have to be preliminary discussion, that is, get people out to dinner so they really are friends, and then really committed to the notion of civil discourse, so that we really do get the best arguments on the table, the best objections. It's a part of making the learnables carry over into the developmentals by having to practice the very thing one's preaching and by having to see it from the other guy's point of view. I gather that some of you in Philosophy 100 are doing a little bit of Plato's Republic. I'm glad. I hope that you read the whole blessed thing. And if your teachers don't, insist with them that they should. But part of what Plato does so brilliantly is to make sure that he gets the best arguments. When Thrasymachus bursts upon the scene in that first book, absolutely remarkable accomplishment by Plato, getting out what the real reasoning behind that position is, and then letting the character Socrates, who has not yet, except I think by one hint, disclosed what his own position will be, unravel the Thrasymachian position. Maybe you're through this already, but if you're not, here's my little question to help your discussion along in that class. My question is, late in the first book, why does Thrasymachus blush? I'm not going to tell the answer to that. I hope that you'll read it. But it's a wonderful thing because it gets the real debate, and it shows a debate that gets a little feisty, but nonetheless, it's not just an academic debate. It's a debate in which I think the characters are living out mimetically the experience of holding the position, and they're the things that we ought to do also be encouraging within, I think, a program of Jesuit ethics. The last of my 6 items for this general, before I turn to the 2 exercises, the last of the 6 items is justice and charity. Here is where as I commented at the beginning of my remarks, where I think the term Jesuit ethics, or sociologically the actual practice of it on our campus, has gotten derailed. I think it's gotten derailed in this way. It seems to me that justice sometimes gets misunderstood as if it were a certain political program. I don't think that's true. I think that justice is probably what Plato and what Aristotle said it was. It's the hint that's earlier on in the first book of the Republic, the hint when Socrates is talking to Polemarchus, and when Polemarchus gives his first answer, that justice is giving to another what is due or fair, and then in the confusion of the conversation, that conversation gets derailed. Before you know it, Polemarchus is defending the position of political justice. Justice is helping your friends and hurting your enemies. They never do come back to that hint. Aristotle says it clearly. But in some quarters, in some discussions of Jesuit ethics, everything gets swallowed up into justice as a political program, forgetting some of the other dimensions and domains of justice, and trying in a curious way. Now here I'm going out on a bit of a platform, a plank here. I think that sometimes justice and charity get elided unfairly in Jesuit ethics or in some quarters of religious ethics. I think that what one needs is, as in these other parts of the antinomy, I think what one needs is a healthier respect for the fact that both justice and charity have obligations with them, but they're different obligations. And so the kind of obligations that one can argue for being the case as a matter of justice are going to be smaller than the obligations in charity. I think the obligations in charity aren't just nice ideas. Charity isn't just an ideal that we may aim at if we like but don't have to. Charity isn't just something supererogatory. As near as I can tell from the 2 commandments of the New Law and from the balance of the New Testament, one has to say that the commandments of love and charity are truly obligatory, but that they exceed the demands of justice. I think that this will still give us an interesting socially conscious alertness in Jesuit ethics, but I think that it will do it in ways that can be much better argued for than the sometimes indefensible claims that get made for things under the heading of justice where there isn't a justice claim. I realize that's a controversial position. I expect you'll see it debated often as this lecture series unfolds. For a minute, I would just like to advert to the Catholic social teaching tradition. Again, the proper subject of another whole discussion. But in that tradition, which has been the Church's way since 1891, the encyclical Rerum Novarum, beginning to tackle it in the encyclical tradition up through Evangelii Gaudium, now of Francis, I think that what you have in this tradition is an effort to do what the Church was doing for the preceding 1900 years, namely of handling both the economic questions and the political questions and the familial cultural questions, but handling it now in the form of an encyclical, and in set of encyclicals and conciliar teachings that often makes this distinction in an antinomic way of saying there's some of it can be argued philosophically, some argued for theologically, some of it is truly a matter of justice, some of it is the much more demanding part of charity. If you'd like a very short text that brings that out, the one that I would recommend is Benedict's first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, specifically paragraphs 24, 25 through about 29, so let's say 24 to 29, where he's attempting to make the case as best he can for the aspects that can be done under the heading of justice, especially by civil authority, and those things that can only be argued for with reference to the gospel, the revelation of God, and especially the commandments of Christ. I think that you will see that stated in a very crisp form. As far as I know it, it's the best way it's been stated in that conciliar and encyclical tradition. Let me turn briefly then, before we end, to the passages that I've also printed for you on the handout. In a way, this is a bit of the documentary tradition. But what I want to show you about it is both two of the exercises that are most prominent in the spiritual exercises. I hope you have the chance to make a Jesuit retreat and to do it in this classic form. In the first one, which is the exercise that you get at the very start of a retreat, notice the way in which we're talking admittedly in the language that Ignatius himself used. Man, the human being, is created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by this means to save his soul. What that is suggesting is that we have been created, and created with a purpose. That is, created both to serve God above all, and to save our souls, our own individual ones, and our fellows. This is the generic use of the word man, not just the word male or the individual person, but rather every single human being and the race as a whole. And that there's a purpose to this. This would not be found in many forms of secular ethics. But then, reflecting on the way the rest of creation happened, Ignatius's position is that everything else on the face of the earth could potentially be used for the accomplishment of those purposes. And, in fact, we ought to make use of these things insofar as they help, and ought to be rid of them insofar as they hinder us. I think the key to that first meditation, however, is in the fourth paragraph. Therefore, we must make ourselves indifferent to all created things. Now, here, let me offer a distinction. I think that there are probably three meanings of the word indifferent, and that Ignatius doesn't mean two of them. That is, I think indifferent could mean we don't care. Supposing you're going to go to the movies, somebody wants this, somebody wants that, what do you want? I don't care. You might not care. That's a possible, legitimate meaning of indifferent. I don't think what it means here. Secondly, I think it could mean the Stoic sense of indifference. That is, cultivate an indifference, really renounce things. The Stoics tried to renounce our passions because they thought them dangerous, and so they really wanted to repress them. They really wanted us to be rid of them. They wanted us to get it out of our system. I think there's a beautiful way in which that is done in Stoicism. I think in a way this is associated with the monastic tradition. If you've ever read Thomas à Kempis, I think that second meaning is Thomas à Kempis's meaning. We renounce various things. But Ignatius's meaning is a third one. I think what he means by indifference in that sentence is a poised readiness to choose whether to go with an inclination or to go with an aversion, depending on how it would help accomplish the purposes for which we are created. Look at his list. He suggests we should be indifferent as far as we can to, and are not under any prohibition. We should not prefer health to sickness. Now, may I ask you, how many of you out there do not prefer health to sickness? Didn't think I would get any takers. Riches to poverty. I still don't see any hands. Honor to dishonor. Are you okay with being dissed? Last one. A long life to a short life. It's like the Monsignor who was preaching at his parish and said, how many want to go to heaven? And everybody raised their hand. How many want to go tonight? And all the hands came down, right? The idea being not that we would prefer the second one in those series of antinomies, but rather that we might have to be willing to embrace it. That is, to take a noble cause even against enormous opposition could mean we would have to prefer to be dishonored in order to hold on to and to fight for what's right. Or any of the missionaries who became martyrs had to be willing to say, I'd rather die for the faith and give witness to it rather than extend my life by in any way equivocating, and so on down the line. It seems to me that what this pattern, this call for a poised readiness is making us examine our inclinations and aversions, not simply to renounce them, but to be free enough to say, I'm not the slave of my inclinations, and I'm not the slave of my aversions. Rather, I can have that sort of freedom that will let me follow the truth even when it's going to be uncomfortable. I can pursue what is truly good and right even when there will be challenges or difficulties. as you can see for the talk I've been trying to give tonight, it's not just a matter of the learnables up here, but the developmentals here. And this exercise in the cultivation of indifference, in this third sense of the word, is the thing that is crucial for being able to live like that. I won't go through the next exercise in as much detail, but I envision it as the same sort of thing. It's further along in the exercises. It occurs in the second week, sometime before one finally gets around to discerning the spirits and making the choice one is aiming at in the full version of the month-long version of the exercises. But the idea here is you've got three classes of men, all of whom have an enormous amount of money, but they didn't get it for the right purpose. And so Ignatius asks us to compare the three classes. In the first class, these people really want to do the right thing, but they never get around to it. The second group, they want to get rid of the burden of having gotten the money in the wrong way, but they want God to change his mind. Wouldn't it be nice if God were just to come and let me keep the money? The third group are the ones who practice the indifference that we saw in the first exercise. That is, they come to the position of freedom where they can say, I can use the money, I can be rid of the money, but the reason for making the choice will be what is for the accomplishment of the purposes, namely the service and reverence of God and the salvation of our souls. And I won't be dragged around by my inclinations or my aversions. That, I think, is the kind of necessary freedom of heart and freedom of mind necessary for the debates that I was talking about, needed for the open-mindedness in a classroom where anything can be discussed, but discussed in the way that you get the real reasons and not some thing that's idiosyncratic or merely something that's a caricature. Last item, and then I'm going to stop. On the other side, what you have is a brief comparison. Again, there's inaccuracies to this model as to any model, but all I meant by presenting it is that when we're attempting to think a little bit more from the side of university life, especially from the point of view of the learnables that one might encounter in philosophy or in theology, I think, in my own voice, I think that there's a connection between the kind of ethics that you offer, the kind of view of the human person, I call it anthropology, like philosophical anthropology, and the type of metaphysics or view on the universe that you have. It seems to me, for instance, that in Aristotle, his ethics is an ethics of virtue and vice, rather than an ethics of right or wrong, or an ethics of law, because he thinks of us primarily as creatures who will live in a polis, creatures who will live in a city, and there will be ways of being outstanding. There are also going to be ways that are in some way or other blameworthy. He does this because in a way he's still an essentialist in his metaphysics. He's still thinking about the type. Even when he privileges the individual being, it's an individual of a type that still makes him, in some curious ways, an essentialist. I've suggested the Kantian model, we've talked about it already, the goals of autonomy, freedom, and the strong focus on the categorical imperative. But it's connected, I think, with the fact that he thinks of personhood largely in terms of functional rationality. If you're not actually thinking and actually choosing, you're not yet or no longer a person. And that this is crucial to his metaphysics, or shall I say the replacement of metaphysics by a certain kind of epistemology that accepts, I think, too blandly the subject-object distinction. You see it in the ever-popular utilitarianism, that is the effort to maximize the benefits for all, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but it largely comes from a position of the human being as an animal of refined pleasures and pains, and a view of human reason that really doesn't discover these things like normative principles in nature. Rather, there's a calculative rationality. What rationality is about is figuring out how to maximize the pleasures and minimize the pains and the burdens, and it has a materialist and quantitatively reductivist metaphysics. By contrast, I think Christianity, both biblical and ecclesial forms, and par eminence, the Jesuit approach to ethics, I think it's one that does have as its root a form of law, the Decalogue as well as Christ's commandments, but also a sense of the gifts and the graces, the natural virtues and the supernatural virtues, and the goal, which is beyond this world, even though there are goals within this world. The vision of the human person is the vision of the human person as created in God's image and likeness, but fallen and in various ways damaged, truly redeemed, but not yet fully sanctified. We have to participate in the sanctification. I think, as you can see, my vision of Jesuit education with this integration of sacraments and scriptures and all the other pairs of antinomies that I've suggested is designed to aid that process of sanctification, including by the clarification of intellect, by the ability to see error as well as to demonstrate and to argue for cogent and sound forms of reasoning. And that ultimately it goes back to the notion of creator and creature, the notion of God as both immanent and transcendent. You see this, I think, in some ancient forms, Plato in particular, for those of you doing that Republic, that he really does have a sense of the transcendent. And in that regard, I'd point you down to the book by John Rist. It's on there somewhere, wherever the John Rist book is. But the notion of Rist's book, Real Ethics, is a focus on the way in which, unless the ethics that one offers has a grand sense of the transcendent, it will ultimately be incoherent. On the other hand, it has to have a sense of the way in which this applies to real human beings, a real focus on what that nature is, how we can know it, and how we can get the necessary help we need intellectually and sacramentally. Let me summarize in one sentence and finish. I don't think that there is a Jesuit ethics that is a distinct contender as opposed to utilitarianism, deontology, Aristotelian virtue ethics. I think rather that what Jesuit ethics means is the way in which, in an educational program, properly considered, worked at constantly, undertaken with enthusiasm, but also with some clear thinking, there is a program to Jesuit ethics which involves necessarily ensuring these 6 antinomies being respected. Without that, I would suggest that it's in some way or other sadly deficient and would urge that we rectify it. I hope that's helpful, and I look forward to your conversation.
We'll just ask questions from your chair. If you raise your hand, Father Kotersk will call.
Please.
In understanding these antinomies as both and rather than as either or, you place in the foreground their eventual reconcilability or integration. But in so doing, debate then doesn't rest with fundamental alternatives. One wonders then what the point of the debate is. Or another way of asking this is, what is uniquely Jesuit in the confrontation with antinomies posed as both and rather than as either or? Because these are familiar from the Catholic tradition in general. Is it the act of integration? Or is it something, or is it the debate about the possibility of integration?
I loved all 7 of those questions. Just kidding. They're wonderful questions. Part of the question, if you couldn't hear, had to do with the way in which what role does debate have if what you really need in these antinomies is a principled consideration of these, each of the pairs of it and the integration of it. I think that's a great question. I think there's also a question that is afoot there with respect to, how do you actually do it? What is it that's going to work? Is there anything distinctively Jesuit? It sounds just generally Catholic. Let me address those two. If I miss something, we can point it out. With regard to the first one, while I think there has to be an agreement on principles, I don't think that in our actual situations, in terms of the people who come, you would necessarily find agreement on those principles. So it seems to me that it might be that with respect to these principles about human nature, or these principles with respect to ethics, I think you might have to debate the propriety of including each of the horns that I proposed in my antinomies. You do need some common ground or you can't have a debate. So my way of starting a philosophy class, it doesn't too much matter what the subject matter is going over the principle of non-contradiction, its buddy, the principle of identity, the principle of sufficient reason properly understood, the principle of causality, various other principles of logic. Until we get people agreed that these are the principles, sometimes showing the meaninglessness of debate without them, you're right, debate can't proceed. But then I think we can have some consideration and even proper debate about whether nature is still a valid term under the antagonism, the opposition that is provided by some forms of empirical or sociological science. I think you could have a very interesting debate with respect to the 4 levels of meaning in the scriptures, whether that's an outdated idea, and so on down the line. So I think that there's still room for debate, but what you do need is an agreement on what debate looks like. I won't get distracted by trying to do Deus Caritas Est as a whole here. Absolutely brilliant encyclical. I think Deus Caritas Est could be subtitled, Our German Shepherd Protecting Us Against the German Wolves. That is, it was an effort, I think, to stand firm against Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche with their attempts at a hermeneutics of suspicion, and insist that we must get back to real debate on any of the issues, but to do the real debate, a hermeneutics of suspicion, a whispering campaign about the secret motives of one or another, will poison the debate at the beginning. Second part of the question, if that's an adequate answer, at least the beginning of one to the first question, the question of, is this generally Catholic? What is so distinctively Jesuit? Maybe the integration and the use of the antinomies. I would say yes. That is, I don't think that a Jesuit ethic should be anything other than Catholic. So that it seems to me to be inappropriate to be dividing those terms. On the other hand, the fullness of doing it as an approach is something that, curiously, was associated with our schools. That is, we're the first order. It wasn't exactly that the order was founded to run schools. It did take Ignatius 8 years till he got around to really putting the stamp of approval on that, but that he quickly realized after the experiments at Messina in Sicily, he quickly realized that this was the vehicle par eminence for doing the 2 parts of the Jesuit charism. I take the Jesuit charism to have as its primary focus 2 points. One is its evangelical character. Second one, the spiritual consolation of the faithful. That is, the evangelical character is the missionary drive. It's what I so enjoyed in Evangelii Gaudium. I think what that apostolic exhortation is about is the need of the church to be outward and missionary rather than to inward looking. And no surprise that dear Pope Francis would come up with that and make this his inaugural statement of the program for the pontificate. It seems to me that this missionary journey, missionary character, absolutely crucial. Secondly, there needs to be the real care of the whole person. That is, not just lip service to it. It's not just a piece of rhetoric designed for our public relations, but it's a matter of making sure that the instruction and making sure that the other policies, the res life and the various forms of working as a business institution and all the rest, that all of this is of a piece. That is, it is organized for the common good and truly integrated. Our schools were founded with that in mind. I particularly liked the early letter by Pierre Favre, newly sainted, from 1544-45. You'll find it in Dawson's book, The Dividing of Christendom, and it sort of sets out the program of this integrative vision and the need for doing this in the campaign of evangelization around Europe. So we welcome others to do it too, but in a way, this group was founded for that, and our system as a system, that is a network of individual institutions, worked well when they were doing it. When they're not doing it, and in my judgment, sadly, they're not doing it enough in our system. I wish they were doing it better. We try. It's hard. But that insofar as they're not doing it, it's the reason why there's something unsatisfying about what we are in fact able together to produce. Dr. Kotersk.
There's a new book that's just been published called Excellent Sheep. I don't know if anyone's read that.
Excellent
Sheep.
Excellent Sheep.
Education of American elite, talking about the education people get in the highly elite schools. And I've read about 2/3 of it. And this person talks about the malaise that is this higher education, which is so disintegrated and does not do the formative function which you talked about in your talk. And all the people that leave because they don't practice this third form of indifference what's interesting about his analysis is I think he gets close to identifying the real problem, but he can never pull the trigger, which is that you really need Christianity or some absolute beliefs of a higher being to really lend purpose to one's life. And so he struggles through this whole thing, identifying the problem, but he cannot produce the answer. But I think you did tonight. So
Praise God. Amen. Please.
My question would be that, sort of building off of Dr. Kuhn's point, that the separation of learning from the action, could that also be in part due to the amount of learning we get in society today is being distanced from actual work and actual experience out in the real world, such that academia has become isolated from the common man's life and common work. So you're not getting real life experience, and you're starting to think out theories in your own mind, and you're not being tested by reality.
I suspect that's right. It's almost an intractable problem, though. See, because if you focus too much on working while you're in school, the learnables are going to suffer. There is only so much time in the day, right? And so part of the difficulty, if you want to do biochemistry and you think you can do it working a 40-hour day, okay. But it's really hard to do the learnables that you need to do if you are working a lot. Now, if you say working just a little bit, okay, that sort of helps. But on the other hand, the problem is that one isn't really doing the formative experience that one can do by really working. So I think there are two solutions, but they're both very hard. One solution is we'll push back the age of going to college till 40. You work for 20 years. I think people would appreciate their college education a whole lot more if they came at it at age 40. And they would, in a way, achieve the thing that you're talking about. The trouble is, most people don't want to push it back. It's a ticket to a wonderful job and a better wage and other great things. Very difficult. Though I think people would appreciate the liberal arts and the reason for them better than some do. Another possibility, but very hard, is to say the administration of any given college, its faculty, its staff, I mean everybody who's involved in this, needs to get on the same page. And if they get on the same page and then find willing students who will be appropriately given opportunities both to think, to study, but then also have appropriate opportunities with respect to living, dating, having experiences of all sorts of kinds of experience, internships and opportunities to do things that are creative. If they were really on the same page, I think you could find a way to integrate this and see the formative aspects aligned to the educational aspects. Huge difficulty in doing that with numbers. Our Jesuit colleges over the 450 years succeeded well when they were small. When they grow to a certain size, the difficulty of managing the size is simply enormous, and we become excellent managers in certain ways, but as I think Dr. Kuhneth was suggesting, we become managers in a way that is lowest common denominator. You said the word cheap. I wasn't going to use that term, but I mean, it could. The idea being, of course, that it gets so reduced to that lowest common denominator, we really aren't seeing the formative value of it. And as far as I can tell, so much of the emphasis is put upon the learnables. Please.
So I'm wondering about this conception of an ethical life. And if I'm getting the thought that you have, the integration of these different antinomies leads, particularly within the context of education, but presumably outside of that as well, a certain kind of integration of these antinomies leads to an ethical life, to the good life in some way. And so that raises for me two questions. One is, do you think these antinomies lead to the good life, or a particular way of realizing the good life? And the reason that comes to mind is I actually, when I look at your antinomies, I also, consistently from a Kantian perspective integrates them, right? Some might have be privileged in different ways than you privilege them, but still nonetheless an integration. But that Kantian, though, I wonder if that kind of integration would achieve a different conception of a good life, one that's compatible or incompatible with the good life that you're, in a sense, presenting.
Okay. So the first question had to do with, is there more than one way, more than one good life? I think the answer to that has to be yes, but they're within a certain range. Even Aristotle, pre-Christian, could talk about the good life and talk about the speculative life, the life in which I think he thought of contemplation of God as at the very highest, but also could think about the good life in terms of making a contribution to the city. I'm a great fan when I read the Nicomachean Ethics, hope that you're reading that at some point in your study. I think the Nicomachean Ethics builds to Book 10. It's not just that these are isolated things thrown in there, but that the lower level virtues of courage and temperance lead to the social virtues, lead to the justice, lead to the intellectual virtues, lead to the virtue of friendship, and eventually gives him his answer that there is a good life that is primarily organized around what we can do for the human community in a polis, and leads to the notion that the good goal of life is prayer and the contemplation of God. We can put that in a Christian format, right, and carry that over, and we get something similar. There are various ways to be a saint. So I would grant that there are plural paths within a certain range, but there's lots that are excluded. Secondly, could a Kantian come to an integrative vision of these things? I would suggest on 4 of the 6 of them. I don't think you could get nature and grace into a Kantian system, and I don't think you get sacraments and scripture into that for Kant because of the skepticism about the possibility of knowing nature, grace as being just an utterly foreign category to anything he's talking about. I think that there's, his whole philosophy of religion, as I understand it in the Religion Beyond the Bounds of Reason Alone, is that religion is a practical postulate, not a speculative one, and hence there's no truth in the matter. There's rather simply whether it's consistent in the way you set it up with the cultivation of reason. So it's going to be a very different resolution, and I would say that he's got a false premise with regard to the understanding of nature and the understanding of grace. Similarly, on sacraments and on scripture, I think Kant would be in a very different, it's going to be a Pelagian treatment of the scriptures as moral example. It's going to be a vision of the sacrament. I'm not sure what he would do with the sacraments, frankly. I don't know the answer to that. I just can't imagine that it would be the answer I've suggested. So I would agree that, yes, you could have a Kantian integration. I would want to, in the debate, argue that he's got some wrong premises, and hence his reasoning, his conclusions are not sound. Please.
One of the things that's always fascinating me about the Ignatian charism is this focus on desire. We see desires in hearts that are like in the rear of our deepest desires. It's very close attentiveness to emotion, feeling.
The Ignatian emphasis upon desires and the focus on cultivating desires, noting the connection with emotions.
Becoming aware of our deepest desires,
Right.
desires of our hearts, consolation, desolation. I'm also very interested in Aristotle. I think that's what's very as well. And I think that Aristotle is one of the remarkable moral virtues. Is really feeling properly. Right? You feel properly that you feel anger in the right way at the right time.
Right.
Because the emotions for Aristotle are not just these blind pushes or surges of feeling. Right? The emotions are discriminatory. They are really a way of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
So Martha Nussbaum's done some really fascinating work on this recently.
But where she gets it so wrong is on not having an ability to decide what's a proper and healthy emotion and what's a disreputable one.
Right. So I guess my question is to what extent there might be some points of parallel between the Ignatian charism and Aristotle's ethical theory, and to what extent Ignatius may have been influenced by Aristotle.
Sure. Ignatius and his colleagues went to the best university in the day and got the highest degree, University of Paris. They read their Aristotle. He incorporates it in the exercises, incorporates it in the constitutions. Is there influence? Without a doubt. How does he do it? He does it through the lens of Thomas Aquinas. I think I have pointed that out in previous papers, and there's ways in which you say he really has got a very deep dose of this. At the same time, he is also alert to the mystical fathers, not just to the scholastic fathers, and he's thinking especially about the ways in which we need to honor those traditions. There's parts of him that I think deeply come from the Augustinian tradition and some of that cultivation of desire, but with a good, healthy sense of the fact that there are disproportionate inclinations, wrongly ordered desires, wrongly ordered aversions. And so I think that what you say is absolutely true. Is there a contribution from Aristotle? Does Aristotle and Aristotelian studies have a role to play in Jesuit ethics? Amen. Does also the Augustinian vision, including a sense of the fall? In some ways, right, the doctrine of original sin is one of those doctrines that's sort of been in the theological repair shop for about 40 years. But it desperately needs to be brought out of the theological repair shop, and I think there's some wonderful books that have done that. My favorite is one by Father Paul Quay called The Mystery Hidden for Ages in God. And a very healthy sense of that tradition is equally indispensable. The Kantian version, again, I think in terms of the formatting, I think in terms of some of the insights and some of the rigor of that, this is why John Paul II can use him and why I think we should. I think that utilitarianism is not compatible. That is, it's the only way in which it's minimally compatible is that if you have satisfied yourself that you've got a course of action that is in itself not intrinsically evil, and if you've got a real clarity that you've got a right intention as regards ends and as regards means, then I think that you can embrace some of the considerations that are typical of utilitarians. But what's so utterly antithetical about utilitarianism, consequentialism, proportionalism, etc., is that they would regard that as the only value. That is, all morality is taken as the calculation of comparable values, and I think that that's a fundamental error. Sure. Sir?
I'm a little bit confused by your usage of nature in
Okay.
nature and grace.
Yep.
Are you associating nature at all with the first principle of foundation? And if not, what is your understanding of the activity?
Okay. So my understanding of nature in the phrase nature and grace, I'm talking about nature as what the human constitution is. So the fact that we've got a bodily constitution and a spiritual constitution. When I'm talking about a constitution, what I mean is a makeup. So that I've got various, when I talk about nature, I'm using it in a very Aristotelian way, namely it's the inner source or the inner principle of a thing's pattern of development and its typical structure when it's healthy, mature, and its typical activities. So I'm using the notion that there is a fundamental structure to development, a fundamental commonness to structure, and a fundamental aspect of operations in which we really flourish. On the other hand, I'm mindful that nature is wounded, and it's wounded both by original sin, by the fall. It's also wounded by the way we've grown up, right? Because we can be dented and damaged, and parts of us can be destroyed. It's also wounded by our actual sins. We get disordered in one way or another. So I'm unwilling to use the word nature as pure nature, as if that were normative. I am willing to say nature can present itself to us so that we can see the norms that God has written in as the natural law. When I get to the first principle and foundation, what I'm attempting to talk about is the fact that in our nature, there is not only this pattern of development, this set of structures which must be honored, these typical activities which do lead to our being fulfilled rather than being frustrated, but I'm also so mindful of the fact that our natures are dented, damaged, wounded, fallen, and they need to be fixed. So what I see in the first principle and foundation is the fact that we have certain inclinations, that is both drives towards something and certain aversions. We've got these things. If we let them rule us, we won't be free in the way that we need to be free, namely free to choose the right thing. We'll be being dragged around by an inclination or dragged around by an aversion. So I take the first principle and foundation to say we need to have self-knowledge, and we need to have self-knowledge judged by some normative standards. What is healthy for us? What is dangerous or further disintegrative for us? When we do that, then we can say, okay, I have this predilection or I have this aversion, but I'm not going to let myself be its slave. I'm going to be its master. In doing so, I don't have to renounce them. Hence, I was interested in suggesting that the second meaning for the word indifference, this renunciation sort of thing, I think misses the passions and the inclinations. It misses a part of human nature if it were the sole substance of our ethics. It can be the basis for a very high spirituality. But in terms of the basic ethics, I think we have to respect that we do have nature and all these inclinations, but we shouldn't become a slave to the distortions of it. We need to be masterful of it, and it starts with this poised readiness or freedom. Did I get your? I think I got your question. Did I no, you're, the gentleman I'm talking to. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Come at it again if I missed it.
Yeah. So the reason I think the first principle and foundation is the patients treated this as inherent reason, or as you said, a reason that gives us hope, the ability to think of what we should do, and a reason that gives us the ability to judge an action or what we're going to be using further experimental spiritual exercises. So as such, when I see that as relating to a specific purpose for mankind. And I would say that that would be inherent in nature.
In our nature.
Yes.
Sure.
So do you not see that as incompatible with the fact that we have a bruised nature as such?
Well, no, because the notion of being bruised doesn't mean destroyed. Right? I mean, if our nature were totally corrupted, then I would say there's nothing that we can get from it, because it's so utterly disordered that everything, in a way, this is the typical early Protestant position, that our natures are so badly corrupted that all God can do is to cover over the pile of dung with a blanket of beautiful white snow. I think that's fundamentally erroneous. So that while human nature has been wounded, it hasn't been destroyed. It seems to me that what you've got, I liken it in my own homely images. If you've been close to me, you see that I bear a cleft palate here. That is, when I was born, the roof of my mouth wasn't entirely connected, nor were my lips joined on the top. So I had to have surgery at 3 days and again at 18 months. I don't remember either. But being told by dear mom and dad what happened there, once the surgery is done for the birth defect, and then appropriate speech therapy, or at least practice speaking well, you can get to the point where, even though there's a scar, there's nonetheless a healing of what was damaged. But you had nature to start with, and the nature still had a direction and an orientation, but it needed to be fixed. Well, I think that's an image for what original sin is, what baptism is, and then what this integrative life is. That is, I think baptism is like the surgery, and it does fix the problem, but on the other hand, there's still more needed. In second surgery, various kinds of therapy, various kinds of practice, examples, and growing up in the course of the rest of the ways the development must proceed. So it seems to me that in that pattern, what we've got is this typology operating. Right? So you've got the wounded characters, that is the history of sin, but then you've got both the model for what it is that the correction, and you've got the ways to enter into that correction sacramentally and in a life of prayer and in a life of virtue. So I don't think they're incompatible. I just think it's an antinomy, and that's why I state it as that way. You're welcome. We have a quiet side we haven't heard from. Anybody on the quiet side? If you're happy contemplating, it just proves my point about two different ways of achieving the good. The contemplative and the practical. Sir, go ahead.
By law and virtue, would you say that the main ones that would need to be planted in the developmental side would be the Ten Commandments, two main commandments of Christ for the law, and then for the virtue, the four cardinal virtues and the three theological virtues?
I think those are fine ways of stating the point in a learnables way. Right? What you pointed out are the learnables. Right? We need to learn the Ten Commandments. We need to learn the two commandments. We need to learn the natural cardinal virtues. We need to learn the supernatural virtues. But we have to practice them. And so it's like the interesting section of Dante toward the end of the Paradiso, when Dante is having his final exam on faith, hope, and charity with Peter, James, and John. And they ask him the learnables question first. What is faith? What is hope? What is charity? But then, and they throw him for a loop the first time this occurs, but do you have it? And what they're asking is it the learnables getting it, but it's also the practicing of it. That is, in the case of, say, the natural virtues, practicing them so as to acquire them. In the case of the supernatural virtues, the theological virtues, receiving them, but then developing them, letting them take root so that they are the way by which we proceed. So as a statement, sure. As a life, there's another whole dimension, and I think you're probably in agreement with that, or at least I see you nodding. Yes? Yes. All right. Anybody else? Dr. Sweeney.
Thank you very much, Father Kotersk.
You're welcome.
Great day to that.